this episode, I was joined by Phil Halper, a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society who was appointed journalist in residence for the Penn State Institution for Gravitation and the Cosmos. He is also known for his incredible work, which is available on his YouTube channel Before the Big Bang, where he interviewed leading cosmologists and physicists on the origin of the universe. I asked him to join me for a discussion on animal suffering, specifically because of his recent work, which was published in the Journal of Philosophical Psychology, along with Williford, Radcliffe, and Fuchs, called Against Neo-Cartesianism, Neurofunctional Resilience, and Animal Pain. As you listen to the discussion, keep in mind that our goal was not to be comprehensive and deep dive in every kind of theodicy or explanation of animal suffering. Rather, we try to build our way to Neo-Cartesianism through interactions with different responses that is given to animal suffering. But as you will see if you listen, that we spend a significant portion of our time deep diving into Neo-Cartesianism and trying to get the gist of the paper. Hopefully it will be useful. So, at the beginning of each of these episodes, I would love to ask for two things. First of all, give us a little bit of your personal background and how your interest started in these topics. And also, if you could provide us with the background, the story of your YouTube channel.
Right, so how did I get interested in all this stuff? I think I've always, as far back as I can remember, I've been interested in the question of God and the universe and where we come from and so on. I recall going on holidays, my father would ask questions about the universe, not like to get answers, just sort of start discussions. Is the universe infinite? And he would be like, how could it be infinite? It couldn't just go on forever. But then how could it be finite? That doesn't seem... And he would ask these big questions. And so I was brought up Jewish in a sort of liberal Jewish household. But they sent me off to the local Hebrew school. This was on top of the state education I had. So sort of a couple of nights after school and then every Sunday morning initially. And then when I was about 12, it was every single day after school. So I was religious at that point. And I think I started to have doubts. I think, probably a few things. One, the Exodus story, I just thought it was immoral. That it cannot be right to punish the Egyptians for the Pharaoh. That just it didn't seem right to me. And also the design argument. So I remember one time they said, Rabbi's going to come into class and give you the proof that God exists. And I think I didn't doubt that God existed, but I thought, I'd like to hear the proof then. I just assumed that God existed. And they gave the design argument. It was straight Paley. I think he talked about the watch on the beach. I remember it. I don't remember how old I was, but I remember I was in Hebrew class. And I just didn't buy it. I'm like, that does not make sense. And I didn't know anything about evolution. I think I'd never heard of Charles Darwin probably, but it just didn't make sense to me. I'm like, you haven't explained anything. So they were probably the things that sort of got my mind ticking. And by the time I was sometime in my teens, I was definitely a non-believer, quite passionately so. And that's always stayed as an interest for me. And then how did I get into the YouTube thing? So it was never really my intention to sort of set up this channel that it is today. I had actually encountered a Muslim apologist called Adam Dean. And he had put some things out about evolution, and because in London there's this thing called Speaker's Corner, where you know it, right? So I'd been there, just occasionally it's fun to just go down there and hear people, and sometimes you get involved in a conversation, and it's quite a circus, nowadays actually it's a lot more of a shouting match, but it varies. Sometimes you go and it's good conversations, and sometimes It's just insanity. But I'd come into some Muslims, and I don't think Adam Dean was there actually, but some of his friends were there, and they were saying, read this, read that. And I thought he was misquoting a lot of evolutionary scientists. So I said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll put a video and I'll explain why he's misquoting it. So that I started the channel for that. And so it was a lot of actually discussions with Muslims. And also they're making claims about scientific miracles, one in particular about the 7 heavens. And I immediately thought, this is nonsense. So I made a quick few videos, and I'd never really expected a lot of people to watch them. I had no sort of grand ambitions or anything, but it just sort of snowballed. And eventually, I remember they actually got me to debate Adam Dean on a TV show, a Bangladeshi TV show. And that just sort of dragged me in more and more and more. And it was ironic was that Adam Dean himself eventually switched sides on evolution. He was very anti-evolution, and then he sort of disappeared for a bit, and because he was quite a well-known Muslim apologist back in the day. This is probably around, I can't remember, maybe 2010 or something. He then sort of disappeared for a bit, and then he organised a conference called "Have Muslims Misunderstood Evolution?" And he had invited a lot of pro-evolution Muslims, and he got into trouble with the sort of, the more fundamentalist ones, and they sort of, it was all a big palaver. And then he went to sort of more, he went more and more moderate, shall we say, more to the sort of non-literalist approach, I think. I mean, I don't know, I shouldn't speak for him, but so that all sort of just dragged me in more and more and more, basically.
This is actually interesting to hear, because I was previously under the naive impression that the debate between the so-called pro-evolution and anti-evolution crowd within the Muslim population was mostly based in specifically the Shia sect. It's good, and I welcome that there seems to be a more pervasive and more open dialogue on this issue within the Muslim population. And there also seems to be a tendency to reconcile the findings of empirical science with different readings from the holy text. Now, you might know Phil from his work on the cosmological stuff and multiverse and so on. As fantastic and as incredible his series are.
Thank you.
Today we want to focus on animal pain. Now, animal pain is just one idea derived from a family of arguments known as the problem of evil. And traditionally, I have to say this at the outset, that the problem of evil has been categorized into 2 different sorts of argument. One is the logical argument of problem of evil, and the other one is the evidential problem of evil. On the one hand, the logical problem of evil wants to kind of show a kind of inconsistency between the omni-properties of God and the fact that there is evil in the world. On the other hand, the evidential problem of evil is trying to appeal to different pieces of data and our observations of the world with regard to suffering, and concludes that given our observations and the data at hand, the truth of theism, the probability of theism should be reduced in favor of atheism or naturalism. Now, this might not be the most comprehensive way of pointing out this difference of categorizing the problem of evil, but this will do for our current present purposes. So at this stage, Phil, do you have anything else that you might want to add?
Yeah, I've always thought that the difference between the 2 arguments is sort of overstated, because to me it's always an evidential argument in that you have to look at the world, right? You look at the world and you see a lot of suffering, and it appears to be gratuitous suffering. So you say that's inconsistent with God being all-powerful and all-loving. But the person could say, well, it only appears to be, but maybe the evidence is, misleading us. So it's not a logical inconsistency, but I think you could say that with anything. There's nothing that you could observe in the world and say, well, there's some way that the evidence is misleading us. So you could always imagine that there's some way that the evidence is misleading us. So to me, all these arguments, any argument that involves looking at the world is an evidential argument. And you can't know that there's evil in the world, or I would just prefer to use the word suffering, actually, because that doesn't require us to define evil in certain ways. But so you can't look at the world and say, you can't say, well, there's a conflict between the suffering in the world and God's omnipotence and his omniscience and omnibenevolence without looking at the world. So, of course, it's an evidential argument. I mean, logical arguments, pure logical arguments, you always have to have some axiom that you start with. So, and anything like this has to involve observation.
So there is really no the problem of evil, but different arguments targeting different things. Now, during our discussion, we are not going to be really nitpicky on the difference between theodicy and defense. More generally, we are going to consider different strategies and explanations offered for animal suffering. Now, be it, soul-making, skeptical theism, and we are kind of going to build our way to neo-cartesianism, and maybe after that considering different responses or explanations. So speaking of animal suffering, Phil, could you get us through animal suffering and maybe one way of accounting for it?
Yeah, okay. So traditionally, particularly Christian theists have explained suffering through the fall. So Adam sinned, and then that brought in pain and suffering into the world. That has been the traditional view of Christians. And the problem is in the modern world, we've discovered that animals have been suffering for hundreds of millions of years before humans ever got here. So that represents a very serious problem for the Christian theists. Their main sort of explanation for the existence of suffering in the world is now undercut. So animal suffering then plays a very significant part in this problem of evil. I think that it's sort of bigger than that, though. I mean, a lot of the discussion that you'll hear about with the problem of animal suffering revolves around that fact, that this very long time span has occurred before humans existed. But I'd actually identify like maybe five, I call it the five fingers, or the expanded problem of animal suffering. So the first finger is the time that animals have been suffering for, and particularly the timing that it happened before humans ever existed. So you can't really blame human free will for this. The second problem is what I would call the problem of the mechanism, that humans seem to get here via violent means. So whether it's sort of evolutionary processes and, animals dying and being eating each other, or disease and so on, but also there's, catastrophic events like meteor impacts, asteroid impacts, and, mass extinctions. If these hadn't happened, I would suppose that we probably wouldn't be here. So what kind of good God would choose this sort of violent means to get to us? So that's the second finger. The third finger is also God's commands. So particularly in the Bible, God commands people to conduct acts of violence against animals. So for example, in the first book of Samuel, God says, now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all they have and spare them not. And that's often quoted by atheists to sort of show that the God of the Old Testament is, pretty nasty. But what's not quoted is the next bit where it says, but slay both man and women, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. So why is he commanding all the suffering of the animals? Why kill all those? And if you look at the sort of defenses used against the slaughter of the Canaanites, a lot of them won't apply to animals, and there's other cases of that. So that's the third finger. And then the fourth finger is not just God's commands, but his actions. So take the Great Flood, humans sin and all the animals are killed. Well, almost all of them. The 10 plagues of Egypt, a lot of them involve killing animals. And even Jesus, in the story of Legion, he expels a demon into a herd of pigs, 2,000 of them, and they rush down a steep bank into a lake and are all drowned. Why does he do that? And then the last one is what I call the problem of the Anthropocene. So at the moment, it looks like we're going through this another mass extinction event caused by humans, and it's predominantly caused by the fact that humans eat meat. So why did God make us eat meat? I mean, he could have easily I say make us, probably that's the wrong phrase, but he certainly enabled us to metabolize meat, and he could have easily not done that. I mean, one miracle, don't let humans metabolize meat, and that probably would have stopped an enormous mass extinction. So why, I mean, there's lots of animals that can't metabolize meat. Why didn't you just make humans one of them? So that's what I would say are the sort of five fingers of this expanded problem of animal suffering. I think it provides a very, very strong case against an omni-god.
Your point on the mechanism involved is really similar to the point that Eugene Nagasawa terms the systematic problem of evil, which is that in a more fundamental level, it seems that the whole mechanism, that the whole system is allowing for these kinds of suffering and pain to take place. Now, you also mentioned the expanded problem of evil, which you mentioned is the topic of your next project that is going to be published. So could you just share some details about that as much as you're comfortable? And what should we expect about that project?
So we published this paper, only a few days ago. It's been in the works for years, actually. But trying to get four people together with different schedules and peer review, and so it's been a long time coming. Anyway, we published that, and then the initial thought on this paper, one of the reasons it's taken so long, is that we were going to address some of the theological questions that are raised by animal suffering and also the scientific ones. And then eventually we decided, no, let's just make it scientific, and then we'll come back to the theological ones. So the idea is now we've got the scientific one out, that we would come back to the theological ones. And so it's just beginning at the moment. I hope it doesn't take another 5 years to come out. Hopefully we can get it out quicker than that. But we'll see. But the point of the paper will be exactly, I think the moment in my head is to explain this expanded problem and to show why a lot of the theodicies can't. They might be able to tackle one or two of them, but it's going to be very hard for them to tackle all of them.
Well, first of all, I cannot wait for that paper to come out. I'm sure that would be awesome as well.
Thank you.
But there is a point you mentioned which we have to come back to. And it's the idea that, okay, maybe, these different explanations of evil, different strategies, the theodicies, and so on, maybe they do not account for all kinds of suffering, but maybe taken together, they at least each of them can explain different types or kinds of evil that is targeted by different problems of evil. But having said that, we should actually go back to the main topic, which is
the four theodicies. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of problems with four theodicies. It isn't only that animals have been around before humans, but there are other problems we can highlight with it. And I think one of the main problems I'm going to call the sort of redundancy problem or a bad design problem. So as you might know from my channel name, I've done a lot of skydiving, and I have a main parachute and also a reserve parachute. And the idea is build redundancy. And we know that occasionally a main parachute will malfunction. I think it's roughly 1 in 1,000 jumps will lead to a malfunctioning parachute. So you have a reserve parachute. You know that this could happen. And you have a backup. The idea is, they're not both going to fail, So where's the redundancy in God? How is it? How could it be designed? How could the world be designed in such a way that one or two people doing something bad leads to the death and destruction and, exile from paradise for like an untold number of creatures? It just looks like terrible design. The engineer should be fired. You've got to build some redundancy into the system. So that's the first problem. So the second problem I would say is that what I call the justice problem. So I think we would all agree that the children of Nazi Germany are not responsible for the actions of the Nazis. And it would be wrong to punish them for what, their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents did. So similarly, I think it's wrong to inherit the crimes of your forebearers. So it seems to me, even if you exclude the problem of the timing, you still have other problems for the fourth theodicy. I just don't think it makes any sense at all. One other problem I should also add is that certainly in the Bible, the Adam and Eve are described as eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So if they didn't know what was good and what was evil, how could they be morally responsible for their actions? And there's another problem as well. I just thought about this one. So for those theists that like to advance the moral argument, so the argument for God from morality is that, we have this objective morality, supposedly, and where does it come from? So if you ask the theist, well, how do you know you have this objective morality? Well, you say, well, look, you just know, it's instinctual. You know that rape is wrong, and it's absurd to suggest otherwise. But the question is, right, okay, so so it seems to me then that the argument relies then on God creating our moral intuitions. But if you believe the full narrative, he didn't want us to have those moral intuitions, right? We stole those moral intuitions and we're punished for having them. So, I mean, there's a lot of problems with all the Odysseys, as you can see.
Yeah, I think, we do really expect good engineers, good designers to build some sort of redundancy into their systems. But another point that really exasperates the problem of animal suffering, I think, is the fact that virtually all species have been wiped out. They are extinct. And many of them we don't know about. And that just exasperates the problem. And it doesn't stop
one
there,
other
right?
thing I'd like to point out is another problem, actually, I should add. There seems to be a lack of a causal mechanism for how this disobedience to God is supposed to create all this suffering. I mean, how precisely? So, okay, I disobey my parent and maybe I spill, the cup that I shouldn't have balanced half on the table. How is it that disobeying God's command not to eat a piece of fruit, it turns all the animals into vicious predators? Were they all sort of herbivores, and then I eat this piece of fruit, or my ancestor does, and then how is that? What is the causal mechanism to turn all the herbivores into predators and send objects from space to create mass extinctions? I just don't see there's any reasonable causal mechanism to go from one to the other.
Right, and there are possible state of affairs where even people who, as we get to it, argue for some kind of animal resurrection, we could use that. We could say, okay, why not just eventually bring about that state of affair instead of from the end?
Yeah, and in fact, that's probably one of the biggest problems of sort of monotheism as it's presented, with a sort of perfect heaven. Why not just create that? I mean, I never understood what the point of the earth is. Just if you can do heaven, just do that. That's, to me, in a sense, one of the absolute biggest problems of monotheism.
I think it's worth pointing out for the audience that Eugene Nagasawa and Graham Alpe have co-authored a paper on the problem of heaven, which is, worth looking up. It could have some implications for what we're talking about. But let's move on to another strategy, which could be that, you could reduce natural evil to moral evil. And that's the kind of path that Plantinga explores, for example, when he appeals to demons, or some sort of, different traditions within, Islamic thought that also could, do the same. So what do you think about that?
So, first off, it has some of the same problems as the sort of standard fall argument. So basically, Plantinga and others have suggested, there may have been a pre-Adamic fall. Maybe it was sort of Satan or something like that. And that is what brought suffering into the world. But one, it has the same problems of redundancy. Two, it has a problem of parsimony. So, if I'm to believe in God, I look at the world and I see all this suffering, and it seems, that's inconsistent with this invisible entity that you're asking me to believe. So how do you resolve that? Well, you would then create another invisible entity, Satan. It just sort of, that violates principles of parsimony. When you have a simple explanation, the invisible entity is just not there. It seems a simpler explanation than there's now two invisible entities. Also, it seems to be, I think it's inconsistent with the scripture that they want us to believe in. So there's no mention of this pre-Adamic fall. You read the story of Genesis, the fall is very much humans. Yeah, sure, there is a snake involved, okay, but there's no indication of any backstory for that snake, so we don't really know anything about it. And so I just don't see that there's why wouldn't it mention this pre-Adamic fall? And then the other problem is, I mean, now some people have said, well, maybe the animals also have their free will and they rebelled against God. So no, okay, so now we've got to believe there are animals rebelling against God, humans rebelling against God, and angels rebelling against God. What does that say about God? Maybe the problem's with him. It reminds me of what's that book called? Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. Everyone else is sort of rebelling against you. Maybe the problem is with you.
I think one thing here which is important, is the role of auxiliary hypothesis, right? So depending on the type of cost that you're willing to pay, the addition of these auxiliary hypotheses might not be the best way to go forward, and they will affect your prior probabilities. So that's exactly one thing that I think we should come back to, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's important, actually. Now you say it, the issue of an auxiliary hypothesis is very important in the philosophy of science. As I'm sure you know. It was thought that at some point that falsification was the criteria to decide between science and non-science, and then philosophers said, I don't think so, because you can always add an auxiliary hypothesis. So you never test a scientific hypothesis. You're always testing it in addition to the auxiliary hypothesis. So even just any hypothesis you like, or you test it with some empirical observation, the auxiliary hypothesis is always that the empirical observations were done correctly. So you're never testing one thing in its own. So you always have to ask, okay, what's the clause? Okay, there's nothing wrong with adding an auxiliary hypothesis to save your original hypothesis. But yeah, you have to ask, what's the justification for the auxiliary hypothesis? And this idea, I just can't see a justification for saying that if God is all-powerful, how can there be these other beings that prevent him from creating heaven on earth? It doesn't seem reasonable. Why doesn't he just defeat the devil if it's all down to the devil? Why didn't he just stop whatever action the devil did to create this world of suffering? Why didn't he just stop it? It just doesn't seem consistent with the original hypothesis.
Oh, I agree. I think we should, get into more details when we will be discussing skeptical theism. But I think we have, for now, sufficiently covered, this kind of approach. Obviously, we're not going to be comprehensive. So let's move on to Cartesianism. Kind of walk us through what Cartesianism is, and maybe, we're going to use that as a bridge to get to neo-Cartesianism and how their views apply to the problem of animal suffering. Yeah,
okay. So I think this is the only solution that the theist has that actually really does work, if true. Unfortunately for them, it's not true. But if it were to be true, it would work. I mean, this would solve, like, all the 5 problems that I suggested solved. So this is the best chance for the theist, in my opinion. So what Descartes is thought to have said, there has been some debate as to what Descartes' beliefs were, and I think quite possibly he may have changed his position over time. So, but the bottom line is, it's attributed to Descartes that he thought that animals were really just completely mechanical in a way. They didn't have any sentience whatsoever. Therefore, you could harm them. It's no different to pulling the gears out of a clock. And the screams that they have are just sounds that a machine makes when it's broken. So that was the view attributed to Descartes and hence known as Cartesianism.
Yeah, I do not think this is true. I would be very surprised if it turns out that this is, the correct view. But anyway, yeah, so for Descartes, if you have a mind or soul, you have phenomenal consciousness, and you will be, fully aware of pain, and you can fully have, the quality of that pain. But if you do not have it, then no pain for you. So that's basically the view.
I just should add, though, that people, in that era, they did use this as a theodicy. It wasn't simply that Descartes took the view that animals don't suffer. It's that him and his followers, well, certainly his followers, I can't remember whether Descartes did this, I think he did deploy this against the problem of suffering, because people, even back then, were pointing out the problem of animal suffering. And this was deployed in that argument.
Right. So, for example, take Nicholas Malebranche,
exactly,
who uses this exact line of argument to account for animal suffering. But now, moving on to what we wanted to talk about, build our way to that, which is neo-cartesianism. So, at the outset, I have to say that some people, the likes of William Lane Craig, have said that, it seems like when it comes to animal pain, atheists really prefer that animals really feel pain, because neo-Cartesians deny this. But I want to point out that within neo-Cartesianism, it's not just that this is a view that is endorsed by religious figures. Secular figures have endorsed this. So this isn't some sort of, exclusivity here. But anyway, let's move on to neo-Cartesianism. So tell us what it is and how it is different from Cartesianism.
Yeah, okay. So neo-Cartesianism basically takes the view that animals are sentient. It doesn't deny animal sentience as Descartes does. But what it denies is that they have morally salient pain and suffering. So it's not the same as Cartesianism, hence the name neo-Cartesianism, a new version. So it's sort of updated. It's supposed to be a bit more plausible. It doesn't, I think people would find it outrageous to suggest that animals have no form of any sentience. But it says, but their pain, they don't, feel in such a way that it's morally salient. And this is an important distinction to make, because when we made I should explain how this all came about. So basically, I was at a debate around, I think it was 2010, about the same time as I was setting up the YouTube channel, actually. And I just attended this debate between William Lane Craig and Stephen Law. I was studying astronomy at the time at UCL, sort of evening classes. And so one of the guys on the course had said, come down to this debate. And there William Lane Craig made this claim. He was debating a humanist philosopher called Stephen Law. And he threw out this sort of neuroscience explanation. He basically said, Stephen Law was saying, he was making this thing called the evil God hypothesis. And it's funny because as a child I always thought, maybe God is evil. So it's funny that Law came out with that hypothesis. I always thought it was probably true. I mean, if the Bible was true, and he basically said, look, his argument was this: you wouldn't believe in an all-powerful evil God because there are too many nice things in the world, rainbows and cuddly animals and, love and, there's too many nice things in the world to believe in an all-powerful evil God. Similarly, there's too many bad things in the world to believe in an all-powerful evil God, and these are just symmetric. And the example he gave of the bad things was, I think, if I remember rightly, it was a Komodo dragon eating a deer, and it takes quite a long, slow, drawn-out death. It's very unpleasant. And so William Lane Craig came back. I'm sure everyone knows William Lane Craig, but if not, he's probably the most famous Christian apologist on the planet, probably, or certainly one of them. And he is a very skilled debater. And one of his skills is to drop a lot of science into a debate and sort of, I think intimidates the other opponent, and bamboozles the audience, makes them sound very scientifically well-versed, So he dropped this claim that, animals don't have a prefrontal cortex and that you need that for self-awareness. And so animals aren't self-aware, so they're not aware that they're in pain, even though they're in pain. So it's kind of a bizarre claim. But so that is how I was in this debate. And I had volunteered at a Dolphin Research Institute. And I knew that there had been a lot of discussions that dolphins had passed several different tests for self-awareness. And so I thought immediately this claim has to be wrong. I didn't know anything about the neuroanatomy, so I tried to learn about it. So eventually I sort of, interviewed scientists about it, and they all told me Craig was wrong. So we made this video, and there was a lot of back and forth. So I made the video. Then Craig replied, and he pointed out in his reply, I said, oh, they call it neo-cartesianism. That's crazy. Descartes had a different view that animals were simply machines. But I think Craig didn't understand the difference between Cartesianism and neo-Cartesianism. And his own source, I mean, he literally quotes Michael Murray as his source. His own source calls it neo-Cartesianism, and yet he criticized us for calling it neo-Cartesianism. I mean, it's just crazy. So, so that is a difference between Cartesianism and neo-Cartesianism. And that's sort of how this came about, basically.
And if I'm not mistaken, there was another reply and, other back and forth, with the reply that...
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of back and forth. So we put a video out. Craig did a video reply, then we did a video reply, then Murray, I'm trying to remember everything now, Murray did a written reply, and then we did a written reply that Stephen Law posted on the blog, on his blog, and then I did the debate with Murray. So that was all the back and forth that happened back then.
No, of course, one thing we haven't covered is that, there might be some greater good to these pains, but that comes, when we want to talk about skeptical theism. For now, all I want to say is that there are different pains, there are different kinds of pains, and also you mentioned that, there are pains that are just useless, and there are other pains that we do not have them, but having them would have been useful.
Right. So this is the point. So Michael Murray, in his book, Nature, Red in Tooth and Claw, he does cover a whole bunch of different possible explanations. So one is that neo-Cartesianism, that animals don't feel pain or don't have morally salient pain, shall we say. The other is that they do feel pain, but that they need to. It's important that they do so. And so I would say there's sort of two problems with that. One is the one you mentioned. There's a problem here is that there are a lot of different types of pain. So there is acute pain, which is a sort of pain that you feel very quickly and makes a very sudden movement in your hand. You would draw a hand from a fire rapidly or something like that. So, that is very useful. I mean, you do need that. But that doesn't mean to say that you couldn't have something that does it without pain. But nevertheless, it does provide a useful function. And inflammatory pain is we have inflammation, and that can also help guard an injury. So again, can be useful. But there are a lot of pains that are not useful, clearly not useful. So neuropathic pain is a very good example, where you don't know any physical cause of the pain. So there's no action that you can take to stop. So you cannot think that is useful, right? That's just a misfunctioning pain system. There are pains that you don't have that would be useful. So, if you come close to radiation does not create pain initially when you come into contact with it. Only later on, as your cells start to mutate, does it give you problems. I mean, actually, a more obvious one is smoking. Smoking does, in fact, gives pleasure to people when they first start doing it. It's only very, very later on that it will cause you problems. So why don't we have pain when you just start smoking? If God didn't want us to drink alcohol, why not just have pain when you drink alcohol? So, there's all kinds of pains that would be useful that we don't have, and then all kinds of useless pains that we do have. So this argument is a terrible argument in my opinion. And I should add, there's something else, another problem with that, is that even if we agree that the pains were useful, the infliction of them is not necessarily useful. So let's imagine, in one debate I used this case of an animal trapped in a tar pit. And this is something, now there's a very famous paper by, I forgot the author's name, about the fawn dying in the forest.
William Rowe.
Yeah, Rowe, exactly, Rowe. Yeah, there you go, William Rowe. So it's a hypothetical example of a fawn being killed in a forest fire. And I thought, let's replace it with a real example, one that we actually know happens, because we actually have the fossil records of them. So if you go to California, there's something called the La Brea tar pits. And there's the remains of like 4,000 direwolves were trapped in a tar pit. So you go, they walk into this area, sticky material, and they're trapped. So maybe one animal is trapped. Then another animal goes, oh, well, look, there's an easy meal. So they walk into the tar pit and they get trapped. And they're literally starving to death. Right? They're stuck there and they just starve to death. They're stuck. right? So even if the pain is generally useful, you can't tell me that the infliction of that particular suffering is useful. That's the problem with that, basically.
And I'll also have to mention that even if some level of pain could be useful, but the degree is important here. We were talking about degree. Like the degree, the suffering is so horrific that the same ends maybe could have been achieved by different means. After all, the tar pits, the animals, and how they are suffering is contingent. There's nothing that is necessitating this kind of results.
Yeah, well, actually, thinking of a contingent thing actually just sprung to mind is that, one time I was bit by a leech and it sucked on my blood. I didn't feel a thing. Now, it has been suggested, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but that the leech injects a sort of anesthetic when it bites you. That's why I didn't feel it. I don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly could be true. I mean, there's nothing illogical about that. And it's certainly rare that when something bites you, you don't feel it. So you could imagine something like that is more widespread, but why isn't it? And if it needs to be there, well, why is it that animal? It's true. Why is that so rare, basically?
Yeah. So the thing is, the domain of possible explanations does not match the offer explanation that the theist gives. There are other candidate explanations available, or state of affairs, I should say, that the theist is just not going to cut it with their response. So having said that, let's move on to the next thing, which is, Michael Murray and the neo-Cartesians are big on this. The neocortex.
Right. Yeah, this is very much what our paper is about. So there are claims about certain structures in the brain. So for Michael Murray and William Lane Craig and a few others, it's the prefrontal cortex. So in the debate, Craig said that you need the prefrontal cortex for self-awareness. Since other animals don't have a prefrontal cortex, they're not self-aware. Now, Murray didn't actually make this claim. He quoted Murray as his source. But as far as I can see, Murray never said this. What he said was that you need the prefrontal cortex for pain affect. Now, we should explain what this word affect means, because it's not one that's in, I think, most people's lexicon. So that's affect with an A at the beginning, not an E. And it generally means the emotion associated with a particular mental phenomenon. So we can think of pain as a motor response. So you could imagine you withdrawing your hand quickly, and maybe you don't feel it. It's just an automatic response. So, I mean, that wouldn't really be pain as such, because pain is supposed to be an emotion. So it's this emotional component of the activity that we call the affect, and in particular, it's a negative affect. So it's something that you don't like. This is the really important bit. So if we ask sort of how this all came about, Murray basically was quoting someone else. And he was quoting someone called Bob Berman. And Bob Berman had claimed that the enlarged prefrontal cortex of humans, of adult humans, I should say, this is important, was essential for pain affect, for emotional states, shall we say. And I think Murray just this, because he then just said prefrontal cortex, not the enlarged prefrontal cortex of adult humans. Now, the reason this is important, because the prefrontal cortex is growing throughout human development. So you don't have a fully formed prefrontal cortex till you're like an adult. You certainly have very little when you're born, and it's growing and growing over many, many, many years. I mean, it's one of the reasons, one of the functions that we do think the prefrontal cortex has is what's called executive function, so impulse control. And because teenagers, their prefrontal cortexes are not fully developed, they act more impulsively as thought. So this is important because, of course, the implication of, so people like Berman were saying it's just adult humans. I mean, obviously it depends how big this thing needs to be. But so you can see that there's actually an inconsistency. Now, the question then is, okay, so why was the prefrontal cortex related to pain affect? And the argument that Murray and others have given is related to a procedure that was very popular in the 1950s for treating pain called a lobotomy. So what happened was surgeons would try and sever the prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain. And so it couldn't send signals, and this was supposed to alleviate pain. And apparently what happened was the patient said that they could still feel pain, but it didn't bother them. That somehow it didn't have this affective component. And so the claim is then, okay, so if other animals don't have a prefrontal cortex, they don't have this affective component. And he's deriving this from these lobotomy cases. But there's a few problems with this. Problem number one, particularly for Craig, is that these patients, in order to report this, have to be self-aware. Right? How can a patient tell you, yeah, I've got this pain, but it doesn't really bother me, and yet this is a non-self-aware being? I mean, it's literally a contradiction. You can't report these things and believe these reports if those people aren't self-aware. So Craig is kind of contradicting his own source, and I don't think he's even thought through at all.
And I also have to mention that Craig says the fact that your pet or animals, for example, do not feel this second order they will get to this pain is not obviously, that they do not have that level of self-awareness to it, but also he says that this is actually, an evidence for the glory and greatness of God.
Oh, yeah. Very important, very important. And in fact, I think he even... Now, one of the posts that he made about this, and I think it's that one, I'll have to double check this, he actually deleted it from his website. And I had to get it from the Wayback Machine to pull it up. But he's got this quote where this shows the glory of God, the ingenuity of God that he's done this for the rest of creation. What an incredible thing that he did for all the animals to stop them from suffering. But the problem is he didn't do this, so it should be the other way round. And in fact, Craig is only repeating what other theologians have said. I mean, C.S. Lewis said in The Problem of Pain something like, I'm trying to remember, I'm roughly paraphrasing here, but it was something like, from the doctrine that God is, I think I might have this quote exact. From the doctrine that God is good, we can confidently conclude that animal suffering is an illusion. Or it's something like, I don't know, maybe it's not the exact quote, but it's very roughly that. But we can just reverse that, from the fact that animals, he's basically saying from the doctrine that God is good, we can conclude that animal suffering is an illusion. But we can go the other way around. From the fact that animal suffering is not an illusion, we can conclude there is no good God. Right? I mean, it's just the exact same argument tipped on its head. Same with Craig's statement, So to go back to the prefrontal cortex, now, let's go back to the lobotomy patients, right? It just isn't true that they said this. They never said this, right? If you go and dig up the case reports, what they said was, what it was not that they didn't mind their pain. It was their anxiety about their chronic pain. So remember, we had this distinction between different types of pain. So acute pain is that sudden pain. Now, chronic pain is long-lasting pain that stays with you for months and months and months, or maybe even years, and that can obviously create anxiety. Imagine you've got cancer, for example, and your chronic pain is persisting. That's probably telling you that cancer is still there. You can imagine the worry that would induce in you, right? So it's that anxiety that was relieved by the lobotomy. It wasn't, in fact, the acute pain apparently was worse than before. So it's not that they didn't have pain. It's that their anxiety about their pain was relieved by the operation. So it's not even true. But it's widely reported in psychology textbooks that, people said they didn't mind pain after lobotomy, but it's just not true. We in our paper, what we did, we dug up all the old case reports and we looked through them, and you can see clear as day that, in fact, the two most favorite people doing the lobotomies and advocating for them was Freeman and Watts. And you can read what they say about it. They say it doesn't stop pain. It stops the anxiety about pain. And they only recommended it for people who are particularly anxious. So it just doesn't do what they said it did. And then obviously the last point to make about there's a few more points to make about the prefrontal cortex. So one is, right, the standard definition of the prefrontal cortex means, the problem with the neuroanatomy is that you open up a brain and the bits of the brain don't have labels written on them, right? So we give them the labels, right? And of course, everyone's brain is slightly different. And So the question is, what is the prefrontal cortex? But there's a standard definition of it, and that would imply that all mammals have a prefrontal cortex. So this claim that other animals, or that it's only, well, they made various claims. So one was that it was only humanoid primates, which is a weird term. It's not a conventional taxonomical term. Or anthropoids. I mean, they made all kinds of claims which weren't really consistent. But, they're clearly, it is distributed throughout mammalian species. And there are birds. Birds have something very similar to the prefrontal cortex called the nidopallium quadrilaterale. And it's known as the avian prefrontal cortex. So they have something, it's very, very similar, even though it's not the same. It's not homologous. But it sort of plays the same sort of function. And the function the primary function of the prefrontal cortex is executive control and working memory. It is not self-awareness and pain perception. So it's just wrong on so many levels. But what was the key thing about our paper was that two of the authors on the paper, or at least two, actually was Perry on it? I'm not sure. So what happened was there was this patient called patient R, also known as Roger. He had his prefrontal cortex and other cortical regions obliterated by disease. So this enables us to test this hypothesis directly. We can now ask, is he self-aware? So that enables us to test the hypothesis that self-awareness is necessitated, or that the presence of a prefrontal cortex is a necessary condition for self-awareness. Well, he was tested in multiple ways for self-awareness and passed every single test. There's no way you could talk to this guy and think he's not a self-aware being. It's insane. I mean, he can point out himself in a photograph. Or pass all kinds of tests. And there were very sophisticated tests that were thrown out. It wasn't just like a mirror test. There's a lot more to it than that. That was reported on like everywhere in the science news. It was a major, major news story because, this is like a black swan type thing. If you've got a hypothesis that all swans are white, you only need one black swan to show it's false. Similarly, if you've got the hypothesis that prefrontal cortex is necessary for self-awareness, then you only need one guy without one to show, well, if he's self-aware, it can't be, right? End of story. And there are other patients as well. We do mention those. So this enabled us to just blow the self-awareness argument out of the water. And then what happened was, so if you want to know a bit more about how the paper came about, when I was preparing for the debate with Murray, I wrote to one of the authors of this paper studying Roger, and I talked to him about these claims, and he said, yeah, it does blow those claims out of the water. I said, it also has impacts for animal pain. And they were like, oh yeah, you're right, it does. Let's write a paper on it. And at first I was like, well, I'm not an academic, it doesn't matter. This is your idea and it's a good one. So they tested his pain perception. So this was actually after I had the conversation with David, but I think it was happening anyway. So it was actually another guy called Justin Feinstein who did the tests on Roger for his pain perception. And I'm not claiming it was anything to do with my conversation, but it did happen afterwards, because I remember speaking to, it was David Woodruff, who is the neuroscientist on the paper. So on the paper is me, there's David Woodruff, who is the neuroscientist, there's Ken Williford, who is the philosopher of consciousness, and Perry Fuchs, who's an expert on pain systems. And so definitely David and Ken were on the Roger paper. I'm not sure if Perry was, but David and Ken were. And so I asked David, I said, what about Roger's pain perception? I said, yeah, Justin's looked at that, or looking at that. So when that paper came out, that was, I think it was like 2015 or 2016, they showed that his pain perception was worse than normal. The technical term is hyperpathic. So the way they test his pain perception is you basically put someone's hand in an ice cold bucket of water, and then you see how long it takes for them to withdraw the hand. And you ask them to try and tolerate as much discomfort as you feel comfortable with. If you get to a point where you just don't want to continue, you just pull the hand out of the bucket. And he just pulled it out very, very quickly. And when he was trying to tolerate it, he moved around too much in the scanner, so they couldn't scan. They had him in an fMRI. But the problem is when you try and scan someone in fMRI, they've got to keep still. Otherwise, you can't get a good reading. So they couldn't get a good reading because he couldn't keep still as he was trying to tolerate the pain. So therefore, he's hyperpathic to pain. And that again blows his claims out of the water, because if that is essential for pain affect, he shouldn't have any pain affect, but he does. And this is very, very important for the distribution question, because it's not only his prefrontal cortex that was obliterated, it was also some other regions of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, also obliterated. And he was still hypopathic to pain. And so this just blows these arguments out of the water.
So I guess we should talk also about hydrocephaly. Was that involved in these remarks that you made, or?
No, it wasn't hydrocephaly. That's slightly different. He had herpes encephalitis. So hydrocephaly is now, that's also very important, because this is when children are born and instead of the cortex getting developed, it's just water, hence the name hydroencephaly. And so they don't have a neocortex, basically. But yet people that have examined them and interacted with them, so they have clear evidence of emotions, of preference, of affect. So this is telling you, and there are other very important experiments that we can go into if you want, that affect is really not happening in the cortex. That is, if anything, is subcortical, which basically, now the argument is that because the large prefrontal cortex is a late evolutionary development, it's not shared against a large number of species. But these sort of subcortical regions that we think is where affect is coming from is very evolutionary primitive. So therefore it is shared amongst a large number of species. So again, we're turning their argument absolutely on its head, and that shows us that actually pain affect is very likely shared across a wide class of animal species.
But just, take another case. So, for example, you talk about neurofunctional resilience, but there are other cases. So, for example, the neurons on your face are there to sense touch and, the temperature. But if there is some kind of trauma there, they could change their function and you could feel intense pain. So the neurons, would change to just feeling this intense pain for you. So there are other ways open, for your brain to develop that same function of feeling. So it's not close to that local area.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just a ginormous fallacy, basically. Let's just suppose that the prefrontal cortex is necessary for pain affect in humans. Let's just say that was true. Okay? It doesn't follow that there couldn't be some other organ or part of the neuroanatomy that provide the same function in animals. So the quote that we had in our press release was that, believing that animals can't suffer because they don't have a particular bit of neuroanatomy is like saying that fish can't swim because they don't have arms and legs. I mean, if I need my arms and legs to swim, I cannot swim without arms and legs, right? Fish don't have arms and legs, but guess what? They can swim, better than me. Better than any human, right? So this is called convergent evolution. So different things can converge on the same function. So it's just a fallacy to say that if there was something that we need to create some function, therefore if it's missing in another animal, they couldn't have the same function. It's just not true.
There are numerous examples of convergent evolution. So for example, echolocation in dolphins also has another instance happening with bats. So it's not just one example. But now let's move on to blindsight, which is something that, Michael Murray also relies on it.
Yeah, Michael Murray and William Lane Craig discuss blindsight a lot, and they're not the only ones to do so. So we should explain what blindsight is and why it's relevant here. So blindsight is this phenomena where you have someone that claims to be blind, but then can seem to respond to visual stimuli on a test, or they do better than average on a test, better than you would expect. Sometimes they could even, sort of catch a ball or, negotiate their way through obstacles or something like that. So this is very puzzling, and it was, mostly the guy most associated with this guy called Larry Weisskranz, and he actually helped us sort of go through this. So he invited me out to Oxford and had a lovely afternoon with him discussing this, and said that there was this claim that basically, there's these two different types of consciousness that some philosophers like to talk about what's called P consciousness and A consciousness. So this is phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. So the idea that phenomenal consciousness is the sort of what it is like sensation, whereas the access consciousness is your ability to sort of create some function in respect to. So the idea is that these blindsided patients have access consciousness but not phenomenal consciousness, and that these can sort of come apart and clearly have in the blindsided. So the suggestion was, well, maybe animal plane is like this, it's blind pain. And so, okay, so on the face of it, you could say, well, it's not impossible, right? There's maybe some possibility to this. But of course, it doesn't work when you think about it. So the first reason is blindsided people, and in fact, what's funny is that William Lane Craig even mentioned in one of his blogs is that he said, there wouldn't be any point in paying for a blindsided person to pay to go to an art gallery because they're not motivated by visual stimuli, right? So on a forced choice discrimination task, if you give them some test, they can do better than chance. But they're not sort of motivated by visual stimuli in their day-to-day lives. So you can, if you observe them in their day-to-day life, they just aren't motivated by visual stimuli. That is absolutely not true with animals with pain. They are absolutely motivated by painful stimuli. You give them a painful stimuli, they change their behavior accordingly. So there's just no question. It's just not analogous. But there's something else that got discovered quite recently, and we noticed, and again, it's relevant to this debate, and no one had picked up on this, is that there had been sort of new pathways discovered that might explain what's going on in blind sight. So what there are, so this is the main sort of visual cortex, visual pathways, I should say, that send information, from the retina to the brain. And they are disabled in blind sight. But there's another pathway that gives sort of quite rapid information that's sort of low, let's say low information content, shall we say. So maybe it just gives you sort of local contrast or changes in motion or something like that. So these pathways are not disabled in the blind sight. So what we think may be happening is that information that's enabling them to have still a phenomenal experience of vision, but because it's manifesting as it would probably manifest as sort of subtle intuitions. They wouldn't, if you ask them, do you see the ball? They're going to say no, but actually they are having a phenomenal experience. But because it's just giving you this very low level information, it manifests as these sort of subtle intuitions, which they can then use. Like actually, as an example, I'll give. Well, I've got this virtual reality game called Beat Saber, and you have to slash these bricks in time with the music with arrows, and I've got quite good at it, and I'm up to expert. In fact, just started doing expert plus mode now, and and the question someone said to me, like, how do you move so quickly, to slash these bricks in time with the music? I said, well, in the expert plus mode is really hard, and I said, well, it's not that I remember the arrow, you couldn't possibly do that, but you do develop a sort of subtle intuition about what's coming next, and I think that's what's happening in these minds. So they're not absent of phenomenal consciousness, and but I think it just isn't analogous to pain in animals. So it's just wrong on multiple levels. There are other things wrong with it too, but I'm not going to go into every single thing. But, but bottom line is blind sight is not a good model for pain in animals.
Now, this actually brings us close to the issue of fish pain. For those who are listening, if you didn't already know, is that, in Persian Iranian culture, there is this tradition that you get a goldfish for the New Year's Eve. So and it's kind of cruel. It was always kind of cruel to me. It just seemed, not. It was just problematic to me in that most cases, at best, the fish didn't have the quality of life that one would expect of it, and yet it was just part of the normalcy of that time. So that was the first time that I asked someone this question. And I actually, told one of my friends back in Iran to ask this. And the answer was surprising. That, just don't worry about it. They don't feel pain as we do. So a section of your paper is actually on fish pain. So walk us through that and what you say about this subject.
Okay, so what happened was, it's amazing. I mean, I just find this absolutely incredible. But up until, I think it was 2003, no one had even looked for pain receptors in fish. I mean, can you believe that? Like, no one had even looked for them. So they're called nociceptors, they're pain receptors. And in 2003, Lynn Snedden and colleagues found them. So people went, wow, okay, maybe there's pain in fish. But it's not enough to find pain receptors. That is not sufficient. So then they did some very ingenious experiments. So what they did was they observed fish in a tank, and they observed where they like to hang out. So there are different sort of environmental features that can be in the tank. So lighting conditions or presence of, objects, like maybe there's like an undersea castle or something. So they found where the fish like to hang out, this preference location. And then what they did was, now I'm trying to remember exactly the details of the experiment, so forgive me if I get one or two little bits wrong, but from my recollection, they gave it, I think it was like a bee sting, some kind of venom on its lips. And then they observed its behavior. And what they found was when it doesn't change its location preference in the presence of that. But then what they did was they provided analgesics in its non-preferred areas. And guess what? It switches location preference. So it gives up something it likes to consume an analgesic, right? That I think is more powerful evidence that they are feeling pain. But there were some people that suggested, well, look, yeah, good experiments, interesting, but look, we think that the pain affect is in the anterior cingulate cortex. And we have good evidence for this because when you put someone in an emotional pain state, that region of the brain lights up. So, and also you can disable it and people say they don't feel pain afterwards. It's not emotionally unpleasant. So fish don't have the ACC, therefore they don't have the pain affect. So what you're seeing is just a sort of mechanical reaction. It's not affect. So when they examined Roger doesn't have the ACC, it's destroyed, basically. So his pain is hypopathic. So again, it's sort of blowing this claim out of the water. Now, in the paper, we go into a bit more detail because there were tiny bits of regions that were still intact, and someone claimed that, that's what's doing pain. But then we found other patients that had those regions destroyed. So they still were hypopathic to pain. I mean, we go into a bit more detail. So it's a little bit more nuance on that. But then also what was interesting is that we found that, well, this is in the Feinstein paper actually, they found that people who had these ACC leucotomies, as it were, sort of equivalent lobotomy, their pain came back afterwards. So it's like the pain was using the ACC and then it didn't need it anymore, So, think of, I don't know, like superhero, like James Bond is being chased, on foot, and then he steals a motorbike, and then he loses the motorbike, but he gets in a car. It's like, okay, yeah, it was using that, but you don't need that. There's an alternative explanation, and this is quite profound, and that is that maybe the reason the ACC, you've got to explain why the ACC does light up in these emotional pain states. So the alternative explanation may be, there's two, if you like, alternative explanation. So one is that it is using it, but it's doing so contingently, so that if it loses it, it can use something else. But another possible explanation is that what is going on is that it's actually lighting up because it's part of the control systems for pain. You are trying to suppress the pain, right? And like a marathon runner, they're on, mile 20, whatever. they're going to be in pain, right? There's no way out of that. But you try and mentally block it out. And that is actually what's going on. Now, if that's true, that would explain very well why these patients are hypopathic. And it would mean that without the ACC, it's not that you don't have pain, it's that your pain is worse. So this is very, very important. And furthermore, there was another claim that you can use machine learning to try and predict people's emotional pains. And this had been done quite successfully. There was a project called PINES, Picture-Induced Negative Emotional Signature, I think it stands for. So the idea is they could predict whether you were looking at something that was emotionally painful or something like that, emotionally upsetting. And they claimed something more like 90% accuracy for their maps. And the thing is, what they found was they did these virtual lesions where they would delete a bit of the map, as it were. So they'd delete and see if they could still have good predictive accuracy. And they did. And so what they concluded was that there was no one part of the brain that was creating this emotional component of pain. And so that, again, strongly supports the notion that pain is not dependent, or pain affect is not dependent on these particular cortical regions, and is likely, therefore, probably affect is from subcortical regions. And there's one thing I should add, sorry, I know I'm droning on a bit, but it's quite important. There are these amazing experiments done by this guy called Jaak Panksepp. He died very recently, but they are incredibly profound experiments. And what he did, he found sort of a number of regions of the brain, they're all subcortical, and if you stimulate them electrically, you immediately get an emotional affect. You get affective response, shall we say. So just to give an example, you can make the stimulation in a cat and it will immediately, let's say you stimulate the fear system. And there are I think it's 7 systems, affective systems he calls it, and it's textbook affective neuroscience. And if you stimulate the fear response in a cat, let's say, you immediately get a fear response, right? Now, if you do the same in a person, stimulate exactly the same region, they immediately will tell you they suddenly feel afraid and they can't explain why. So what's that telling us? It's telling us that basic affect can be stimulated by these subcortical regions. You don't need this advanced cortical regions, where maybe, probably the sort of higher thinking is happening, right? So I agree that without neocortex, you're not probably going to be doing differential analytical calculus, right? Granted, yes. So higher thought, complex thought is dependent on cortical regions. But there's a difference, I think, between cognition and affect. So cognition, is very much related to cortical regions of the brain. But pure feelings are not. You do not need a cortex for pure feelings. That would explain why these patients still have emotional responses. That would explain why these children with hydrocephaly still seem to have emotions. It just explains everything, and it's verified by experiment. Because what you can do, not only do you see that these animals get exactly the same responses when you stimulate these regions of the brain, but you can also give them control over the stimulation. And for positive emotion, things that human beings describe as a positive emotional state, they will always switch that on. And for negative things like pain, like fear, they switch it off. So if you can give them a lever and just switch the stimulation on or off. All the negative ones they switch off, all the positive ones they switch on. So that's telling you so much. It's saying this is not just a reaction, this is a feeling. And you don't need all this cognition, you don't need, some people think, maybe you need to be a philosopher to be conscious because, it's all about self-reflection, I mean, it's not about that. It's about feeling.
And also, some people might think that this is somehow, we're talking just about these simple things, but what Phil says is really profound. So when, for example, take rats. You could give them control over, what would the outcome of these stimuli would be for them. and they actually prefer the choice of when to turn on and when to turn off, the stimuli. When it is painful, it's always off. So it's not, and presumably without having, a sense of this awareness, you couldn't do this. There shouldn't be, we shouldn't expect to find this. The fact that there is evidence for it, it just does undermine this idea that there is somehow this strict disconnect that the neo-Cartesian wants it to be between humans and animals.
Right, correct. There's a spectrum of consciousness, and but you do not need the sort of complex thought that human beings probably share with few other animals, like the sort of really difficult problem solving that human beings can do. And obviously certain cognitive things only human beings can do, obviously, right? I mean, no one's claiming that a dolphin could build a Large Hadron Collider, obviously, right? I mean, forgetting the fact they don't have the limbs to do it, but you just don't need that. What you need is emotional states, feelings. And there's a great book, I'd recommend it to everyone. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, actually. I've just started reading it, by Mark Soames. And it's called, let me think, it's called The Hidden Spring. And he makes this same argument, basically, that we were basically saying in our paper, which, is only just come out, but it's been years in the making. And in fact, we submitted about 2 years ago. So he makes exactly the same argument, and he's very eloquent. And yeah, so we can think of consciousness as not as having at least two components, probably more than two components. But there is the cognition, this deep thought that you get into. But there's also feelings, and I think feelings are primary. And Mark Soames says the same thing. Feelings are primary. Cognition comes later, but you don't need this higher cognition to feel pain, and for it to be morally salient. You just have the raw experience and the fact that you don't like it, and not just mildly don't like it. You'll give up a lot of resources to stop it. That's how much you don't like it.
It is an amazing book. So if you're listening, do read this book. It's an amazing book. At this point, I think we've sufficiently covered the issue. Is there anything else that you want to add?
I think that gets the gist of it. Yeah, I can't think of anything essential that we haven't really covered. There probably is something I've forgotten, but that's okay. Yeah, I think we've got the gist of it. Yeah.
Now, probably we have to move on from this topic. Given the fact that this is not the majority position.
Sure.
with atheists.
Yeah, I mean, we should be fair. I mean, most theists don't make this claim. It's only, but it is some very prominent ones like C.S. Lewis and William Lane Craig. They are very, very prominent names. So. But I think most theists wouldn't say this.
Yeah, sure.
But some do.
But the reason for our focus on it is because these ideas are not limited to their geographical locations. So obviously they have traveled elsewhere, and they have been influential. So that's the reason for our focus.
Well, actually, ironically, Adam Dean, the guy that got me involved in all of this to begin with, he made the same claim on a British TV show. Exactly. I mean, he was famous for just copying and pasting William Lane Craig, so it's not a surprise. But yeah, so it's got into the Muslim world as well.
But I've heard this. When it comes to the nomic regularity, for example, some people say, okay, at least there is some sort of majesty, in evolution, in the order that you see. True enough, you say that, it has this some sort of, horrific scenes, but it has still some sort of aesthetic quality, like the majesty of nature, that you witness. And this actually came up during your, discussion with Randall Russell on animal suffering. I just wanted, to add the fact that, sure, granted, as you said that, yeah, sure, granted, there is some sort of majesty in nature, but there is, I think, one really important aspect to it is there is an argument called an argument from beauty, which, theists use. But there is also the flip side of it, the argument from ugliness. So maybe, no one is saying that nature wouldn't be majestic if you, let me put it another way. Given the choice of witnessing animals tearing each other apart, like when you are witnessing, you're traveling somewhere and you're witnessing animals and the wildlife, and maybe not witnessing that horrific action of, animals tearing each other up, that sight of the ugliness that even you see from that is just, it must be considered as a downside to that, even if, there is some kind of majesty to it. Aesthetically, it doesn't seem to me to be working. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, of course, the argument from beauty is absolutely right, matched by the argument from ugly. I mean, if there was no omnipotent God, omni-God, I should say, then you would expect there to be beauty and ugliness, right? If people don't want to argue that, well, the beauty in the world is explained by God, how much beauty should there be based on theism? Because clearly there's also ugliness. For every rainbow, there's a rotting corpse. Wow, in fact, probably more rotting corpses than rainbows. So how much beauty should there be on? I mean, it's just, I think a post hoc, oh, there's something nice, we can explain that with God. I don't find it very impressive.
Another thing I have to mention is I would quite like it if these failures to account for evil, there should be some sort of argument. For example, the argument from failed theodicies or failed defenses. I mean, imagine how long these defenses or theodicies were offered. Maybe people even relied on some of them, to kind of justify some of their, moral actions. And there seems to me that there should be some sort of cost or, some sort of reduction in the confidence of someone that is offering something somehow similar to that account.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, they used the full theodicy for how many hundreds of years, and now, well, it's been completely undermined. How come God never guided the Pope or anybody away from this? Well, I'm sure there were some people that disputed it, but clearly it's an enormous failure on their part, and there should be some consequence to that for the confidence in their beliefs, but it doesn't. People will rationalize themselves out of it, obviously.
I mean, the fact remains that there is some sort of data that doesn't sit well with theism. So there has to be some sort of, reconsideration going on here.
Yeah, I mean, there should be a price. There should be a price. I mean, Paul is very clear, in my opinion, that the cause of the suffering in the world is the fall. Right? That's very clear from Paul. So if you want to say, okay, we'll accept that we need to come up with a new theodicy now, what do you have to say about the reliability of what Paul is telling you? You should be saying, well, maybe we should throw Paul out. There's got to be a cost there.
Yeah, so basically I think there are two things. One was, the cost of being wrong when your explanations are wrong. And second thing, which is really frustrating to me, on the popular level, is the allegation that, oh, look, atheists used to believe that the universe didn't have a beginning. And then they changed their mind, after the Big Bang.
No, it doesn't. Anyway, we'll come back. We'll do that on another episode.
But just imagine that you're living in that kind of universe where the universe had a beginning.
Yeah, to be fair, it may have had a beginning. We just don't know it did. Yeah.
The response shouldn't be, oh, you said this, now you're saying that. Of course, both, the theist and the atheist and anyone else with any position here, where there might be odd exceptions, but generally you could, accommodate different sets of data in your theories, in your worldviews, in your explanatory commitments. So we're not saying that this is completely irresolvable. You can't do that. But this allegation on a popular level is really, frustrating.
Right, but again, right. So here's where some of this analogy, well, should explain some differences, I think. So let's say that all atheists believe the universe was eternal into the past, and then it's established clearly that it had a beginning. Okay, the question is, does atheism itself predict that? All right, or is it, was it just a common belief amongst atheists? I mean, if you went back to the 1930s, probably it's true that most atheists were communists. That was probably true, but atheism does not say you should be a communist. It just happened to be the case that they were. But there's, I don't believe in communism. I'm very anti-communist. I think it's a terrible way to organise a society. But, but it was the case that atheists were mostly communists back in the 1930s or 20s, So the question is, did it come from your belief, or was it just sort of an accidental add-on? Now, the claim that the fall is created by humans seems to be integral into the Bible and the Christian story. It doesn't seem to be something that was added on by later theologians. And there are things that were added on by later theologians. In fact, the idea of a beginning to the creation ex nihilo is not in Genesis. There's nowhere where it says creation ex nihilo. But it was an add-on from Christian theologians, right? No question about that. Christian theologians did have that belief, and many of them still do, right? But if that was shown to be false, I think the Christian could rightly say, well, that wasn't really integral to Christianity, and they could say that, right? But they can't say that about the fall. Fall is essential to their whole story, their whole narrative. So they can't say, well, that's just a little add-on, we can ditch that. No, you can't.
So how I always go about this is to just point out the difference between consistency and entailment. Of course, there are different positions, philosophical, social, political, that are consistent with atheism. But that doesn't mean that atheism entails those same views. So, for example, an atheist could be an existentialist, could be a communist, but atheism itself doesn't entail that. And the same thing goes for theism. Theism, could be consistent with different beliefs and positions, but itself doesn't entail those positions. So that's one thing. Another thing I wanted to point out is that I feel that this issue is also related to the recent developments on literature on axiology of theism. So Kierkegaard, who has written on these issues, points out the distinction in his book Axiology of Theism and Other Worldviews, if I'm not mistaken about the title, that there are different categories of people and anti-theism and how it could be cashed out. So one way would be narrow personal anti-theism, and the other one would be wide personal anti-theism. So the whole question is about the fact that should we prefer God existence or not? And the narrow personal anti-theist would be, the individual or some individuals that for them the non-existence of God is justifiably, preferred. And for the other side, the wide personal anti-theism would be that, it's justified for all individuals, to prefer God's non-existence. So I'm quite keen on developing some sort of an argument that relies on animal suffering to the conclusion that, it is actually wide, to establish wide personal anti-theism with regard to the fact that one should prefer God's non-existence, given the fact of animal suffering.
Well, I think where you might run that argument is that it does appear that God endorses the consumption of animals. So a lot of people might say, I'm justified in eating other animals because God gave them to me to eat. So had he not done that, if we lived in a world without any belief in God, then people might not have that justification, and maybe they would be a little less confident in their moral compass when they consume meat. So that might be a way to run the argument there. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry for that. We got a little bit off topic. But let me turn it back to the problem of evil. So as a way of, final observations.
Yeah, actually, can we just, one thing that we haven't covered is skeptical theism. Should we mention that? Okay, sorry.
One thing I wanted to mention at the outset is that just considering the explanation, it seems to me that embracing naturalism just accounts for these facts. Like because, there are rival explanations to theism that I have no idea what should be the additional, factor that trumps other explanations in that area, and theism would be, the victorious one. Because there are other, I don't know, an indifferent God, some sort of deism that is also consistent with the data. I mean, you could have many different sets of explanations that are just consistent with these facts that are rivaling, the theistic approach.
Oh, well, you can go wider than that. I mean, there's some versions of Gnostic Christianity that believe that there was a pre-story to Genesis, and that the creator God in Genesis is an evil God, right? But there's another realm before that where there's a deeper realm. Jesus is from that realm. And so you could imagine that the creator God of Genesis is an evil God. So you could embrace that. You could embrace a deist God. There's all kinds of things that you could embrace given this data of animal suffering. But where you run into the problem, of course, is an omni-God, that's all-powerful and all-loving and all-knowing. That's where you're going to have a problem. But any other conception of God that doesn't entail the omni properties, I think our argument is going to, be less forceful, really. Because if it's a deist God, well, I don't see how animal suffering contradicts that. So our argument is really against an omni-God and any other conception of God. Like, if there was an evil God, fine.
Yeah, you're obviously correct, depending on the dialectical context and what different arguments of evil are targeting, the results are going to be different. I think we are good to move to skeptical theism. So basically, the idea behind the skeptical theism is some sort of cognitive closure. So, for example, imagine you're considering, or someone is considering theism, and you look at the world and you see different types of, pain, suffering, and you see some sort of inconsistency, or at least you have problem, to see how does these sit well with, an omnibenevolent and, an omni-God. And then you would conclude that, I don't see any good reason, that there is no good reason here to my mind, so there is no good reason. And the skeptical theist says that, I'm really skeptical of the jump you just made from, the fact that you just didn't see any reason, any greater good in these evils, and jumping to the fact that you say then it follows that there is no good reason. No, it doesn't follow that there is any good reason. And the fact is, because you're limited in your faculties, in what you're considering, maybe the reasons for them, for accounting for these evils just lies behind or beyond your, faculties or your competence. So you're not really justified in driving this conclusion from the data you have at hand. So it's basically the idea of no-seem inference, the fact that you cannot see a justification or, a reason for these types of evil does not mean that there is no such a thing or such justification for these evils or no greater goods for them.
Right, okay, so how do you respond to that? So, yeah, I think, okay, so basically what they're saying is you see something bad, it appears to be gratuitous, but there might be some hidden good that you don't know about. You're not in a position to say. So the problem with that is for every hidden good, there could also be a hidden bad, right? So let's reverse things. Let's turn their argument on its head. Suppose some child, let's imagine there's some child dying of leukemia. Okay, you pray and they die. They don't get better. They just die. And the priest is probably going to say something like, God moves in mysterious ways. We don't know the reason why, but God had a good reason. Okay. Yeah, and there could be a good reason. Maybe that child was going to grow up to be the next Hitler. So it was a good thing that he died. And we couldn't possibly know that. So it's always conceivable that there is some greater good that we don't know about. The problem is, let's go the other way. Let's suppose that people prayed and he lived. Now, are the theists going to say, let's not declare this a miracle, let's not praise God, because for all we know, the child that lived is going to grow up to be the next Hitler. So there's a hidden bad, right? No theist does that. Come on, let's be honest. They're never going to do that. They're going to go, what a miracle. Fantastic. Praise be to God, right? So the problem is they're not treating things symmetrically. Yeah, you've got to be consistent in your application to hidden properties. So for every, yes, you can say that there could be hidden goods for any bad situation. But since there can be as many hidden bads for any good situations, you shouldn't be praising God for all his apparent miracles. So that's the first problem. The second problem, and this is why I like this idea of the expanded problem of animal suffering, when you include some of the things that God does in the Bible, he actually gives you his reasons, right? So you cannot now appeal to hidden motives and mystery of God. He tells you the reason why he's doing it. So the flood is there. He explains it. He says, I'm doing this because you all sinned, right? So there's not some hidden mysterious reason. Same with one of the worst things is the 10 plagues. I mean, the first plague is he turns all the rivers to blood and kills all the fish. He doesn't have a mysterious reason. He says why he's doing it. He says, I'm doing this to show off my power. And that he even hardens the Pharaoh's heart to make sure that this ordeal is dragged down, not from 1 plague to 10 plagues. And he's giving you the reasons. I mean, he says it clear as day. So I just don't see that you could possibly run the skeptical theist argument in these cases. You might say it for the sort of terrible, horrible way animals kill each other in nature. You might say, I don't know why he allows that, but there's going to be a good reason. But you can't say it for the things in the Bible where he says his reasons, unless, of course, you want to be maybe like a super skeptical theist and say, yeah, but those weren't the real reasons. You know, he just said that for some reason, but that's not the real reason. There's some hidden reason. Okay, I guess you could conceive of that, but then why not just throw the Bible out, right? Because you can't believe anything. I mean, I've got this idea that basically maybe there is a God, right? And he did give us the Bible, right? But he did it as a moral test. He deliberately put lots of bad things in it and lots of good things in it. And your moral test is to condemn the bad things and praise the good things. So yes, I can praise the bit where Jesus says, love your neighbour. Nice. I can give a thumbs up to that. But the bit where he says, you know, I'm going to wipe out all the animals in a flood, you are to condemn that. And if you don't have the morality that God wants for companionship in heaven, and he's going to send you down. Now, I could come up with a narrative like that. Of course, no theist is going to take it seriously, right? They're going to come up with whatever reason that can't be true. But I would say, you don't know God's reasons. You know, this seems to be consistent with the moral intuition that he gave me. You know, if you want to run the moral argument, you've got to kind of believe that my moral intuitions ultimately come from God, right? And this would explain that. So I'm going with this explanation for the Bible. And I can run with a design argument and a cosmological argument. And I can say, yeah, all good arguments, all backs up my point that God exists. He gave us a morality. He gave us clear things in the Bible that are immoral, like the torturing of animals. And we are to condemn them. And if we don't, you're going to hell.
And there's another thing to it, you know. You could, for example, have another sort of real world scenario, and this is really important in distinguishing it at the forefront of what I'm saying. Is that I'm not saying, I'm not affirming that be a skeptical theist should be, you know, morally speaking, in paralysis. But let's say that there is somehow, you know, this group of people that are actively working, you know, to undermine God and how it's perceived, like Christianity, or maybe if you prefer Islam. They just go against everything you believe, you know, and everything that the theistic world is built on. So, for example, maybe there would be some sort of earthquake, you know, they are hit this with horrible earthquake. So what are you going to do? It seems to me that there have been some similar, maybe the most controversial part of what I'm saying would be the similar part. But even if it's not similar to something that is in the biblical or Quranic narrative that has happened to this relatively the same group of people that have undergone these catastrophes, what you would do, I expect, what everyone would do nowadays would be to say, oh, we should actually, go and help them. But if you're a skeptical theist, there might be good.
I think what you're saying is spot on. I've always thought this, that skeptical theism should, although it doesn't in practice, of course it doesn't, but it should, if you're being consistent, lead you to moral paralysis. You shouldn't help someone because God didn't help them. And maybe there's a reason God didn't help them. Maybe there's some greater good that you are preventing from helping someone in distress. You obviously act. Here's the thing. In any consideration, whether it's whether to help someone or do some action or believe in something, you have to go with the evidence in hand. There's always a possibility that the evidence that you've got is misleading you in some way. That's always a possibility. But you've got really no choice but to just go with the evidence in hand until new evidence comes along that changes things. So at the moment, it looks like there's gratuitous suffering. And if I have the opportunity to relieve that gratuitous suffering, then I should. Right? Yeah, of course, it's always possible that by doing so, I'm actually preventing some greater good. And it's always possible that God has some greater good. I could say it's possible for anything. Like, I could imagine it was possible that Hitler had some good reason to do what he did. Right? That's not, you could talk about the logical problem of Hitler and the evidential problem, right? You could say, well, logically, it's not impossible that he had some good reason. Maybe he had some precognition that a Jewish person would create a super weapon that would destroy the earth. He didn't know which one, so he had to kill them all, right? And he couldn't tell people this, so he had to stir up anti-Semitism, I mean, you could always come up with something, right? The problem is, do I have any evidence for this? Of course I don't. So there's no reason to take it seriously. So there's no evidence for these greater goods, apart from, of course, assuming you've got some independent argument that there must be a good God, and we have to consider that, of course. So, but other than that, I think the evidence points to the suffering being gratuitous, and that speaks against the existence of an omni-God.
Right. And I just to kind of bring it back to the, explanatory virtues, like simplicity, consistency with data, and so on. One of the things that, for example, Gregory does labels it as power for explanation in his book, Theism and Explanation, is that the good explanations can distinguish between different state of affairs. But if any state of affairs that we, present you with, and your answer is, maybe there is some reason behind it, maybe there's some other greater good justifications behind it. I'm not saying that that's just useless. I'm saying that in terms of an explanation, it's just not good enough.
Right. I mean, I think obviously it does depend on the argument that you think there must be a good, all-powerful omni-God. If you think you've got some reason to think that must be true, then I guess there has to be some reason that you don't know. And you just have to go with that. So the question is, how powerful are those arguments? Well, the problem is a lot of those arguments don't support that. So if you believe in the cosmological argument or the design argument, or even the resurrection or the miracle of the Quran or any of these things, none of that actually points to an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God. You could easily imagine that there is a powerful God, powerful enough to make a universe, but not all-powerful. It could be a deist God who doesn't interfere with the universe. So so what argument really is giving you this all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing, non-deistic God? And what could you think of? Maybe the ontological argument might give you that. So are you really saying the ontological argument is stronger than this argument? I guess probably what it is going to boil down to then, isn't it? And I find the ontological argument very weak. And I don't know many Christians that think it's convincing. I don't know about Jews and Muslims, but but I think it's a weak argument. But I guess that would be the only thing you could potentially use in this field. Then maybe that would give you the credence that there must be a good explanation.
With regard to what we said, a while before about auxiliary hypothesis, just look at the data. Here's where I'm, much more sympathetic to naturalism. Just look at the data, okay? You can explain all these results, okay? Maybe all is overselling it. Let me be modest. It explains it better than the theistic view. It just does. And the naturalist doesn't need auxiliary hypotheses or some other sorts of reasoning that they're going to appeal to for that. So that just seems to me to be just consistent with data, deep enough also, you could, one of the virtues of good explanations is that it gives you depth. You could have one view with very few, basically what I'm trying to articulate is the position that Graham Oppy articulates. You want the most minimal commitments when you are articulating your worldview with the maximal scope, breadth, and depth possible. And it seems to me that in those terms, Oppy is right, that this specific explanatory virtues of naturalism is a big problem for the theist.
Yeah, I mean, if you take my 5 fingers, as it were, like, okay, so why has there been hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering before the fall? There's no God. It's easy, right? Next one. Why is the engine of our creation, like evolution and catastrophe and mass extinction, so violent? There's no omni-God. Easy, right? Why is it that, what was the third one? Why is there God's commands in the Bible? Why do they appear so violent to animals? Well, easy, because it was written by people of their time, right? And they were living in a more violent time. Why is God's actions so violent against animals? Easy, because it's written by people of their time. And lastly, why is it that humans are able to digest meat? Well, easy. There's no good God who cares about animals. So all 5 problems solved with the same hypothesis. Can that be true of theism? I doubt it.
So one thing we have failed to touch on is the soul-making theodicy.
Oh, yeah, that's true, yeah.
It seems to me that when it comes to, the soul-making theodicies, the duration is important in our considerations. So there are numerous cases where just there isn't enough time for any, development. Just consider, I don't know, some kind of bird high on the tree that just hatched its eggs and just fell down the tree. There is just no time in these cases for any development.
Well, okay, so the problem is that if you consider some of the suffering of animals that we've talked about, let's take the animal stuck in the tar pit. I mean, it's just stuck there. What is the soul-making supposed to be here? Consider another one, the command to kill all the animals in the Canaanite slaughter. Presumably, the other animals that weren't killed, the Israeli ones, let's say, right, if that was a good thing, that their souls were made because they were slaughtered, I don't see how this is soul-making. Why didn't the other animals have the same opportunity? It's not fair on them, right? It doesn't seem to be equitably distributed, this soul-making, right? It doesn't seem to have, and generally, it is true that, if you're bringing up children, you do actually want them to maybe get bruised or whatever so that they can learn from it. But there are generally limits. If you found a parent that is happy for their child to run through a landmine, and if they lose a limb, well, that'll teach them not to run through landmines. Soul making, you would say that's insane because you're just going too far. It's just not worth the cost. And there are other ways for people to learn lessons. I find you can learn lessons about life just by reading about it. Telling stories. There's lots of ways to learn lessons than utter pain and torture. It's not the best way to learn lessons. And also, God is morally perfect, right? He didn't go through all this suffering. So why couldn't he create other morally perfect beings that also don't have to go through all this suffering? There's no reason why he couldn't. So it seems to me that this soul-making theodicy, therefore, does not work.
And it seems to me that temporally, if we are looking at if we are considering allowing for us to figure into our considerations of, the soul-making theodicy, the amount of time or duration, it could be that some animal just doesn't have any time.
Well, correct. I mean, if you look at turtles, the mother turtle lays its eggs. Its strategy is to lay like several hundred eggs. Most of them are going to get eaten alive and one or two will survive, right? Where's the soul making there? They all die shortly after birth. Yeah, and I've always wondered about that. What about children, human children, right? If you're interested in soul making, well, they didn't get the chance for any soul making because they died shortly after birth. What about them? Was that, how is this supposed to work? It doesn't seem to be a consistent story here. Why isn't the soul making equally distributed?
And also, it seems to me that the price is too much. Like, if that's the way to go, it seems... I wouldn't think that would be worth it.
Well, one challenge I'd put to anyone that has a soul-making theodicy is, would you like to go through that suffering so you could make your soul or your child? No? Okay. So don't give me the soul-making theodicy.
Yeah, this seems to be an apt way to put it. But anyway, this has been fun. We also exceeded the time that we thought we could, cover the whole thing. This has been really fun and interesting. Thank you so much, Phil, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.